trust.
Yeah, so around his pelvis, he's got a textile item, and you can see these buckles that are used to hold the textile onto his body. So there would have been something else around the back of him, like a sort of linen strap or something holding it. Obviously, in the Middle Ages, a hernia wouldn't have been operated on, so they found a way of trying to make him more comfortable.
To hold it in place.
To hold it in place.
Physically.
He has died literally holding it in place.
It's so moving to see his hands just laid out. You can almost see him in life, holding on.
Now the question is, why wouldn't this have been removed when he died? Medieval people believed that when you were resurrected at Judgment Day, you were resurrected perfect at the age of 33. No matter what age you died, whether you were an infant or you were 110, you would be resurrected in perfect condition at the age of 33.
33, the perfect age,
the age at which Christ died on the cross. So the assumption is not that he needs this for resurrection. He needs this for the journey through purgatory. And what we find with these medical items is what they particularly leave on the body are the ones that are to do with mobility and allowing the body to walk. They thought it was a real physical place, and although they knew the body was in the grave rotting, they thought their loved ones were physically experiencing purgatory and literally walking. And so if they died with an impairment which would make mobility difficult, they were leaving objects on the corpse to assist them.
The idea that the living could help the dead through purgatory didn't stop at equipping them with physical support for the suffering they would endure, because the Church taught that that suffering could be shortened if the living offered spiritual help to the departed soul. Praying for the dead or hearing masses for them could actually reduce time spent in purgatory. So when people in the Middle Ages wrote a will, they were concerned above all to make sure they'd be remembered with prayers and masses. We think of wills as a way for the dead to bequeath property, things they can no longer use, to those they leave behind. But for the people of the Middle Ages, wills were also a way for the dead to keep a hold on the living, to make sure they couldn't simply be forgotten. And that was certainly true for Margaret Paston. In 1482, Margaret was 60 years old. Since the death of her husband John 16 years earlier, she'd been a wealthy widow, the matriarch of the Paston family. Now, her thoughts were turning to her own approaching end. Margaret was a very practical person, and hers was a practical will, dividing up the contents of her house, beds, bed linen, kitchen equipment, and her best clothes, between her children and her servants. But the main purpose of Margaret's will was to direct the ways in which she'd be remembered. She left detailed instructions about her funeral and the candles that were to burn around her grave here in the church at Mortby. And she described the elaborate marble stone engraved with the arms of her Mortby ancestors that was to mark her tomb. But this wasn't just about leaving a memorial of her wealth and status. The inscription round the stone would also remind all those who saw it to pray for her by asking God to have mercy on her soul. The Church taught that the best way to shorten the departed's time in purgatory was to leave money for masses. So Margaret left money to pay a priest to sing Mass in Mortby Church every day for 7 years.
In nomine Patris, Filii, Spiritus Sancti, Amen. Troibo ad altare.
A Mass was the greatest help a soul could have because it was the holiest and most sacred act of worship, a repetition of Christ's sacrifice on earth. Because when the priest consecrated the bread and wine, it became the body and blood of Christ. It wasn't clear by how much a Mass would shorten the pains of purgatory. But what was clear was that the heaping up of Masses would do a soul a great deal of good. So it's no surprise that the richer you were, the more Masses you would pay for. And if you were a king, you would leave as many as possible. Just as Henry VII had had a magnificent and elaborate funeral, so his will, now kept in the National Archives, is no less excessive. In fact, it's the longest of any English king. In life, Henry had a reputation as a miser, but he was clearly prepared to spend in death. Henry begins with a long paragraph giving his soul not only into the most merciful hands of him that redeemed and made it, but also to the Virgin and all the holy company of heaven, that is to say, angels, archangels, patriarchs, prophets, apostles, evangelists, martyrs, confessors, and virgins. He leaves money for the chapel he's building in Westminster Abbey, which is to contain a tomb for himself and our dearest late wife, the Queen, and upon the same, one image of our figure and another of hers, either of them of copper and gilt. Crucially, in this chapel, priests will say masses for the good of his soul. These masses were so crucial for Henry's prospects in purgatory that they were to go on forever. Henry was leaving what was known as a chantry, funding for a priest or a college of priests to say masses, in this case until the end of time. But even perpetual masses weren't enough for Henry. As extra insurance, he left detailed instructions for a huge number of special masses to be sung as soon as possible after his death, giving his soul a turbocharged start to its journey through purgatory. Here you can see in Roman numerals 10,000 masses to be said forthwith and immediately after our decease. And Henry knows exactly what he wants. 1,500 of those masses are to be said in the honour of the Trinity, 2,500 in the honour of the 5 wounds of our Lord Jesus Christ, 2,500 in the honour of the 5 joys of Our Lady, 450 in the honour of the 9 orders of angels, 150 in honour of the patriarchs, 600 in honour of the 12 apostles, and 2,300, which maketh up the whole number of the said 10,000 masses, in the honour of all saints. The willingness of those who could afford it to pay for spiritual help for their souls meant that money poured into church coffers. Endowments for chantries didn't just pay for priests to sing masses, but also for the buildings in which they were sung. As Henry's will specified, his chantry was housed here, in his exquisite chapel in Westminster Abbey. It's a particularly regal and expensive example, but all over the country, the building of new chantry chapels shaped the later medieval church physically as well as spiritually. But churches weren't the only buildings that could help a rich sinner through purgatory. Another good way of helping your soul in the next life was by helping others in this one, through the foundation of charitable institutions. And the results could be remarkably long-lasting. This is Norwich Great Hospital, which was founded in 1249 by Bishop Walter Suffield. In the Middle Ages, hospitals like this one not only received the sick, but fed the poor. And its primary aim was to give the needy a Christian community in which they could die well. This was an impressive act of Christian charity. But as historian Carol Rawcliffe explains, there was a great deal in it for Bishop Suffield too. What are these documents?
They both relate to Walter Suffield, Bishop of Norwich, and to this hospital, because founding a hospital is one of the very best things you could do to ensure that you have a quick trip through purgatory and your soul is saved. And this is his will of 1256, which has got his seal and the seals of the witnesses on it. It's a spectacular document.
So this is a very personal document. It's all about looking after Bishop Walter's soul.
Immensely so. This is his passport to paradise, if you like. So there's money for masses, there's money for poor relief, there's money to his servants. He's particularly investing in institutional charity, and particularly in this hospital here.
So it's a very cohesive system. Bishop Walter's not just doing a good work by looking after the poor, but the poor are also looking after him.
Oh yes, it's mutually supportive, and you could argue that the poor are doing more than the rich, because although the rich are very successful and happy in this life, it's the life to come that really matters. And people are very aware of the biblical parable of Dives and Lazarus, which is a very powerful story. And it's about a rich man who has everything, and this poor beggar who's sick comes to his door and asks for charity, and he sends him packing. And this poor diseased man dies in a ditch, but he goes to heaven, whereas Dives goes to hell. And Lazarus begs God to release him, but God refuses because Dives has been so cruel to the poor. And people took this to heart, especially the rich. And it's interesting to note that this hospital where we are now is actually on the bishop's doorstep, because his palace is just across the road. So what he's saying is, I'm not Dives. I'm taking care of the sick and the poor. They matter to me because they will take care of him in the next life. And their prayers, the masses that are said here, will ensure his place in heaven.
But what if you didn't have enough money to set up a foundation on this lavish scale? Were there other ways that you could make sure that your soul would be remembered?
Oh, you could do it very easily, as we can see from this remarkable and now unique document, which is a register of all the people who gave money or land or perhaps a pair of sheets to a leper hospital outside King's Lynn, the Gaywood Hospital, dedicated to St. Mary Magdalene. And most of these people are very ordinary. Weavers, carpenters, cloth workers, people who would probably only be able to afford a few pence. And it's a sort of snapshot of a list of people who supported the hospital and whose names are written down in the book of life, as it were, so that they will be remembered whenever Mass is celebrated.
Each entry starts with pro anima, meaning
Yes.
for the soul of, and then the names come and come. It feels so personal, doesn't it? These little snapshots. Piers Woodhouse, I can see here, and his wife, Anastasia.
Yes. And it would be put on the altar during the Mass, so that these people are next to the body and blood of Christ, as was believed. And the names would probably be said once a year. The book would be read out from start to finish, to actually say the name as an act of commemoration.
So death was absolutely central to the experience of living.
Unfortunately, yes, because life is transitory. Someone compared it to a sparrow flying through a baronial hall. It's just over like that. And it's the next life that you must concentrate on, because all around you, the people you know, the members of your family, are dying young. So you must make provision for what comes next.
Preparation was all very well, but what if death found you suddenly and unexpectedly? To the people of the Middle Ages, an unprepared death was a terrifying prospect. The Church urged its congregations to be constantly ready for death by following Church teaching and leading a good Christian life. But heavenly help was also at hand, thanks to St. Christopher, more commonly known as the patron saint of travellers. But in the Middle Ages, it was believed that no one who looked at an image of St. Christopher would die a bad death that day. And that's why more paintings of St. Christopher survive on the walls of medieval churches in England than of any other saint. This is the painting of St. Christopher at Paston Church. Now only delicate traces are left, But when the Paston family came to worship here, it was newly painted in vivid colours. It shows the giant figure of St. Christopher crossing a river. Balanced in his palm is the Christ child, carrying the weight of the world in his left hand and raising his right to bless the saint. This unmissable image was painted opposite the door so that people would see it when they came in, and so ward off an unexpected death, for that day at least. Death wasn't only in people's thoughts, it was also part of the fabric of their daily lives. Every Sunday, they walked through graveyards into churches filled with tombs, and some churches even housed skeletons within their walls. The Bone Crypt at Holy Trinity Church in Rothwell, Northamptonshire, contains the remains of 1,500 people. No one knows exactly why they're here, but the fact that they were gathered into the church tells us how powerful a sense of community there was between the living and the dead. This physical presence of the dead among the living was a graphic reminder of what lay ahead for all mortal bodies and the need to pray for the souls of the departed. But what happened when bodies piled up so quickly and so high that the dead threatened to overwhelm the living? That's exactly what happened when England was visited by an apocalyptic plague that we know as the Black Death, though contemporaries called it simply the pestilence, or the Great Mortality. The plague reached the south coast of England in the summer of 1348. By the end of the following year, almost half of the country's people, perhaps 3 million men, women and children, were dead.